to flourish in these types of practices and value systems. And I think this is a very powerful representation of how the women were thinking about creating that space in multiple ways. They also discussed fostering future generations of scholars in terms of creating paths for future scholars. For some, this was connected to their scholarship, and it involved providing opportunities for emerging scholars, for their students, for future scholars, by including them in their work, in their academic work. And so this next photo represents that. So this is the cover of one of the women's, one of the books that she worked on. And in this book, she has a number of student voices. But the cover was designed by one of her former students at a former institution who is now about to graduate with her doctorate. And so she talks about what this photograph represents and what that means to her and that connection to bringing into the circle future Indigenous scholars. And she says, I wanted to use this picture because that is what that represents for me. And also I'm very proud because it was done by one of my former students at my previous institution, who was also a contributor to the book. And I'm really proud of her and all the things that she's accomplishing or has accomplished. And she's finishing her PhD, and I'm just really proud of her. So I wanted to make sure to try to highlight her work and highlight her talent and what she's done. And so for me, that represents that too. You know, seeing your students and seeing them evolve and seeing them grow. Another one of the women discussed the intergenerational connections of traditional knowledge and scholarship. She provided a photo that I have included up here because it includes some of her family members. But she provided a photograph of herself, her mother, and her daughter, and she titled it 3 Generations. And she explained that the photo represented the intergenerational lineage through which traditional cultural knowledge and self-identity are conveyed. These women represent the women who came before me and the women who will come after. And in discussing how the photo related to her experience as an Indigenous woman scholar, she told me that while I believe that my research and scholarship are important, I recognize that my work builds on and is only possible because of those before me. Further, my work will be a part of what the next generation and those that follow has as a resource to extend our knowledge. This gives me courage that my work is part of something greater, and I don't have to feel like I'm alone or the author of the definitive moment. And so I think that's another really powerful statement in how the women saw their work connected to past generations and future generations. So collectively, the women's narratives focused on some aspect of community building, both being a part of and working to build a community of Indigenous scholars, but also they acknowledge that being a part of a community of Indigenous scholars, particularly Indigenous women, was critical to their experiences in the academy. Furthermore, they recognized that the intergenerational connections of their work as Indigenous scholars, and they embraced their responsibility to foster future generations of Indigenous scholars for the benefit of the community, of their home communities. And so in thinking about this and how the women, this is just a small piece, but how they talk about those responsibilities that they carry as Indigenous women in academia, then we think about what that means. So our responsibility to securing the future for our people, to our communities, is one that Indigenous women take seriously. And this is often framed in discussions of motherhood and kinship responsibilities to assure the future of our people. But the responsibility of securing the future for generations to come can also be extended to Indigenous women scholars. Building a community of Indigenous scholars is necessary to securing a place for future generations in academia or in these institutions. and it's critical for ensuring that our work in the Academy continues to benefit our communities and to build tribal nations. The need to develop and foster the growth of future Indigenous scholars has been addressed by a number of scholars. Vine Deloria Jr. spoke pointedly about the task of current scholars to build alliances, reminding us that the same principle that tribes have followed must be adopted by this generation of scholars. An attack on one is an attack on all. While Deloria's call for building alliances was based in a need for protection in these colonizing spaces of the Academy, in a time where there were even fewer Indigenous scholars in the Academy than there are today, it remains relevant. And building a community of Indigenous scholars is critical to our efforts to utilize our work in the Academy to create space for future generations of scholars, to assert Indigenous knowledge, and to foster nation building. Still today, we continue to address the need to bring new scholars into our circles, to bring new Indigenous scholars into our community of scholars, and to foster an ethic of responsibility to the future generations that will come after us. As discussions around transforming institutions of higher education into sites that foster tribal nation building and honor Indigenous knowledge systems, and as discussions of the roles of Indigenous scholars as catalysts for dismantling systems of colonialism within these institutions continue, it's imperative that we address the need to build stronger communities of Indigenous scholars. And the stories of the women that I've presented today represent the efforts that are currently taking place among Indigenous women to build a community of Indigenous scholars and to foster future generations of Indigenous scholars to carry on the task of securing our future. The narratives of the women in this study remind us that Indigenous women will continue to be critical to the work of community building, just as we always have. And as this work takes place in educational institutions, it is imperative that we seek to honor the voices of Indigenous women in the Academy. I think we have a few minutes. I'll try to keep it on schedule, Lloyd. So we have a few minutes for questions.
I'm just about to, with a good group of hard workers, launch the Native American Social Work Studies Institute at Highlands University School of Social Work. And one of the concerns that I've had about my profession as a social worker through the years is that social workers are not held in very high esteem. If you just think to yourself, what's a social worker like? What do they do? That sort of thing. You all have your own pictures of this. And I've been in practice since 1962, so I've been at this a very long time. And one of the realities that has occurred in the profession of Native social work is that we are, our reputation is that of fixers. Call them up and get them to do this, pick up somebody, do this, whatever. There has not been developed within our profession a scholarship. We have maybe, I don't know how many, 30-some social workers in academia. I see I'm on their list, so I see them doing things. One of the things that I notice about their communications is their distance between academia and the people. And these people sitting in these ivory towers are talking about, let's talk about cutting edge, whatever, and so forth. I'm not sure in which universe the cutting edges are placed. But my point here is that, like social work, like the history of social work, I see right now, every day, what I think is a very serious error. We no longer recognize an intelligentsia among our own people. It's moved to academia. And I think that's dangerous. And I wonder, how can the content and the substance of what all of us study and read and so forth and so on, how does that maintain its integrity if we remove the seed of intelligentsia from the community to places like this?
Thank you for that. I think that raises an important point. That when we often think about academia, we think of it as, we've long kind of held this notion that we, as Indigenous people, we're removed from our communities. And I think a lot of people now, many of the women in this room and that we've heard from today, are moving away from that disconnect and working to create spaces that honor I'll use your term, the intelligentsia, the Indigenous knowledge systems as valued and valuable, and that challenge that there is only one way of knowing something.
I think you misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting that anyone, you or anyone else, or even me, because I'm in the same damn boat, is not doing what you just described. My point is that we, despite our ability or whatever, however you want to describe it, the fact remains is that there is this environmental, I don't know what you want to call it, but that remains, that a lot of people who still are on the res don't have sense enough to come off of it or something. And so there's not that appreciation of the real intelligence and knowledge that exists in our communities and has to remain there. And that we don't recognize it, is what I'm saying, in the way that we need to sustain.
No, I completely understand what you're saying. I think what I was beginning to allude to is that particularly the women here talk about that, and it's not presented, I focused on a couple of things today, but they talk about the knowledge that resides in our communities, but they also talk about a healthy balance of the place of that knowledge in our communities and not in these institutions, and how they grapple with that. They talk about those experiences, but they also acknowledge the wisdom and the knowledge systems that have always been in our communities. And that's a critical part of it for many of them, and for many of us of our work. But it is a challenge, and it is something that I think that we grapple with, and trying to find that balance. But I do think that there are a number of people that do recognize that and do honor the wisdom that resides in our ancestral knowledge and in our communities, and that has always been there. And many of them actually talk about that.
Thank you, Heather, for your presentation. Just to go, I guess, a thought I had in this discussion and the question you raised was, I see that dilemma, and I think in Native American studies in particular, here and at other, in national conferences where we meet as colleagues of Native American studies, I think that's the intention, is to do the reverse, is to change the institution so it's recognizing those Indigenous knowledge systems and including them in our courses and seeing them, I guess, not just acknowledging them, but sharing them with our students who, given the cultural and linguistic change of our communities, may not all have access to that knowledge in their communities. And, but how can we reinforce that, even though it's a Western institution? How can we modify or adapt what we're trying to do here in a way that acknowledges it, respects it, and teaches it, and to help our students to transform their communities as well. Yeah, to sustain it.
Well, I think when we think about that, it's part of that dismantling that I talked about is that privileging of those knowledge systems in these spaces, not just acknowledging them, but privileging them as the wisdom that they represent. And I think that that's when we do see that happening. So thank you.
I think partly what would help facilitate that is working more collaboratively and less unilaterally. We tend to think about inviting people to our space in academia, like, let's come here to the school and do a lecture and have, you know, a rotation of speakers coming. But I think, especially within Indigenous communities, it would be more beneficial to the students who are, for lack of a better word, trapped in this very modern city, urban landscape. And for them to be removed from this space and taken to where the elders reside in their element and learn from them in that space. I think that would have a much more powerful impact on those students going forward and building that relationship and honoring the elders as really a traditional Indigenous perspective.
Any other questions? Okay, well, I'll hope, thank you.
So just a quick announcement. The silent auction is still ongoing until 4:30, so just to be aware of that. And then also there'll be a bottle of water being put here on the side on the table, so if you're thirsty, just go ahead and go there. I'll be doing that. So just to give you a heads up on that. Thank you.
Hello, Yate, Naval Patero Yinchia, Giani Nishlan, Ziplictim, Bashichi, Logan Dashiche, Navishkishan Dashanale. Hello everyone, my name is Navalin. I am Navajo and San Carlos Apache. I'm double majoring in philosophy and Native American studies, and I'm a senior this year, so I'm graduating. And I just wanted to introduce Dr. Michelle Hale. She is from Oak Springs, Arizona. She is the Assistant Professor of American Indian Studies at Arizona State University. Dr. Hale's current scholarship focuses on issues of tribal government and policy, state-tribal relations, community development, and planning. Please help me in welcoming her. Thank you.
I'm going to invite everybody to stand if you like and stretch. I know we've been going through been a lot of information, so feel free to stretch before we right, good afternoon, everybody. As mentioned, I'm Michelle Hale. I'm an assistant professor at Arizona State University in American Indian Studies. And before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge my dad sitting in the back of the room there, John Hale. He's a Korean War veteran, and he's going to be 94 years old in April. So I'm so happy that he's here this afternoon to take part in this. Welcome. I also want to thank Lloyd and Native American Studies here at UNM for making this happen and for extending the invitation. As Governor Teller mentioned, this is a very humbling opportunity to be among so many esteemed women. It's amazing to hear the voice, the words, the work that people are doing, and I think it definitely inspires and encourages a future that I think is going to be very positive for our communities. It's always a joy for me to be back in Albuquerque. I grew up in Window Rock, and although whenever we had a chance to kind of go to the big city, to go to town, once in a while we would go to Phoenix, but mostly those trips meant coming to Albuquerque. So I have such great memories as a kid coming to Albuquerque. It usually meant going to Windrock Mall or Coronado, sometimes seeing a movie. Once in a while I would get to ride the city bus with my cousin, which was a lot of fun. But just such great memories of this place. And also, when I was in graduate school, I was able to come to UNM for a couple summers in a row. And actually, I'm going to date myself by sharing this, but it's been almost 25 years that I was part of the Tribes program, which was sponsored by the Council of Energy Resource Tribes, and that's actually when I first had the opportunity to work with Tiffany here. And so we co-taught the Native American Studies course back in the late 90s, and actually Dr. Gray Eyes was also one of our students in Tribes many years ago. So it's really neat to see people kind of continue their educational and professional journeys, and just a reminder that a lot of us have these connections that go way back. But I really enjoyed those summers. I was able to come here. At the time, I was a student at University of Arizona in Tucson, and although it does get hot here in Albuquerque, it usually was nothing like what it was in southern Arizona. So it was always nice to come here. At ASU, what I teach, especially lately, has mainly been in the realm of community development. This semester I'm teaching a course in reservation economic development, and I also co-teach a course in tribal community planning. It's a course that I've developed along with Professor David Piafka out of the School of Urban Planning and Geographical Design. It's been a really interesting and kind of different course because it's brought together students from urban planning along with students from American Indian Studies to talk about community development. And I mention this because a lot of this really kind of informs the current work that I'm doing, and some of what I'm going to talk about today, I guess what might appeal to academics, is the pedagogy aspect of it, in terms of the fact that I think some of what we've learned in trying to work across disciplines to create a course that hopefully is relevant, that's culturally appropriate, that honors history, and that honors decision-making in tribal communities. It's been an interesting journey trying to create that course, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that today in terms of the importance of working in that interdisciplinary space, but also some of the challenges of creating a curriculum where maybe when we first come at it, we're not on the same page, know, in a lot of academic disciplines, we have our own language, we have our own literature. Sometimes we have our own methods and approaches to the way we do things, and when you work across disciplines, sometimes, the initial effort of it is involved in trying to get everybody on the same page, and really trying to figure out what your common goals are to advance whatever it is that you're working on forward. So David Piaka and I have actually we co-authored some articles on this pedagogy, if anybody is interested in that. But I think it's interesting in terms of putting a finger on some of the new areas where I think we really need to put more literature out there in terms of community development work that's informed by what we do out in Canadian communities. The other piece of what I want to talk about today has to do with community partnerships. And several people mentioned previously that sometimes there's a divide between what we do and what we talk about in scholarly circles, the ivory tower, if you will, and what is actually happening or what might be needed out in tribal communities. Sometimes we refer to that as on the ground or in the trenches. The real world is sometimes what that is referred to as. But I think one of the goals of what we've been trying to do in terms of this interdisciplinary curriculum in community development is to bridge that divide in terms of trying to figure out how do we create college courses, how do we create more literature in our fields that truly reflect what it is that contemporary tribal communities are interested in talking about. What kind of information can we work on? What kind of research can we do to help inform maybe some of the decision-making that is happening in tribal communities here and now that might actually be useful in terms of helping them to fill in the blank, any aspect of community development that they might be working on. How can we be helpful and not simply be in a position where we're producing research for research's sake. So some of that is also what we've been striving to do with this. So the objective, and again, I really appreciate the opportunity to do this paper because I've been sort of grappling with various aspects of community development to this point. But what I think is different about this particular paper is it really does give an opportunity to tell the stories of some really innovative and interesting efforts that I think are happening out in the communities, and they're efforts that oftentimes people aren't aware of them, because they're not high profile, they're not things that people are necessarily tweeting about, they're not things that get a lot of attention in terms of positive work that's being done in the community development realm. So one of the first objectives that I want to work on with this paper is to challenge nation building and create space for grassroots innovation. I first began to sort of grapple with nation building when I was working on my dissertation many years ago. I actually had the opportunity to work with Native Nations Institute, the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development. And so, my dissertation work was really kind of informed by that Harvard Project, Cornell Cult take on nation building. A model and some ideas that really were kind of born out of 1990s era thinking about governance and about economic development. When I got to the point of doing my dissertation, I was very interested in looking at the applications of nation building in terms of Navajo Nation local governance. So a lot of my dissertation work was really kind of focused on applying a nation-building lens to see what local communities, Dr. Greyeyes talked about the importance of the local today. And in my dissertation, I really kind of grappled with, how do we turn nation building, if you will, upside down in terms of, in the case of Navajo, focusing not so much on Navajo Nation, the nation that is Window Rock, the governance, the leadership that's kind of happening and coming out of Window Rock. But how do we look even beyond that in terms of what is the nation building that's happening on those local levels? Several people have alluded to that today, that for a community as large as Navajo, that can be particularly vexing because we have such diversity within and among our more local communities. So, that's when I really began to kind of appreciate a different take on nation building in terms of really starting to focus on the local iteration of it. And I really like this idea of community building because I think it implies some of that work that's happening on those local levels. And again, what I think is important about this, and important to note that some of these efforts aren't things that are getting the publicity, because a lot of times these efforts are happening separate from what is being decided or pushed or advocated for in terms of that larger government. Again, in the case of Navajo, some of what is happening out in our chapter communities or some of what might be happening with maybe Navajo nonprofits in urban areas, are very effective at what they do in terms of building community. But they're not quite always part of what Navajo Nation is advocating in terms of development.